Welcome back. Joining me in the studio is Ross McNeill, Superintendent of the Victorian Counter-Terrorism Command. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Firstly, tell us about your career with Victoria Police.
Well, I started as a very, very young man. I think I was 17 and joined cadets many years ago now, and I think it's nearly 39 years later, here we are. So I've sort of moved through inner city policing. Most of my work has been general duties, driving around in the divisional van, and promoted to sergeant. Worked in the crime department and the drug squad for a fair bit, and most of the people that were in underbelly, I'd had some sort of involvement with those guys. Now I've moved into the Counter-Terrorism Command, and
Could you explain what the Counter-Terrorism Command is and what your roles are as a superintendent?
Sure. We've the organisation established the command just on 2 years ago, and there are two divisions, and one of the divisions is operations, which my colleague runs, and my division is capability. I'm responsible for all of our training, our national engagement, a lot of connectivity with international partners, and we do an awful lot of work in countering violent extremism.
How would you define radicalisation and terrorism, and are they different?
Radicalisation, just in terms of what it is, in and of itself isn't a significant issue. It's that move towards violence as a component part that is our main concern. People are entitled to have views of all different sorts, and we may not agree with most of them, and we probably don't. But at the end of the day, people are entitled to have a view. It's that pushing that view in a violent manner that, as I said, is what we're more concerned about. Particularly in the current environment, we're seeing an awful lot of perhaps vulnerable people being drawn to an extremism that can often lead to violence. That's our real concern. And I say vulnerable people in a sense of people that are perhaps a little bit less connected with the community than you or I would be, a little bit more withdrawn perhaps, and being engaged online by people who are either overseas or here, can actually have an influence on people and draw them into the extremist view of the world, often quite ill-informed, but again, being vulnerable, that's the attraction, is it becomes a connection that they perhaps don't have.
Yeah. Do you think that vulnerability comes from mental illness or low socioeconomic status?
Socioeconomic status I don't think is a significant issue, and I'm quite happy to be proven wrong, but we've tended to find that that sort of drawing into the radicalisation is really about disenfranchisement to a large extent. A little bit of an us and them mentality, in a sense of I'm alone, or quite lonely. My core group of peers is very limited, so it's that isolation rather than the socio-economic. And mental health is a significant issue that's coming out of recent research, telling us that there's probably a large percentage of people that have some sort of a mental illness aspect that does make them more vulnerable and susceptible to this type of, I was going to say brainwashing, that's not right, but the type of social media that they can get engaged with. So the mental health aspect of things is quite significant for us.
What are the most effective ways to counter violent extremism, considering the unpredictability of lone wolf terrorism attacks?
Yeah, there's a new terminology for lone wolves. They're called lost dogs. It's not as sexy, and it's probably more accurate. They do tend to be a little bit lost souls, in that sense. So perhaps one of the strongest ways, and it's coming out of research in Denmark and a number of other places, is the engagement process. If people do the wrong thing, it's suffer the consequences, and we understand that, but we can jump into that process of radicalisation towards extremism much earlier. That preventative approach doesn't have to be a policing approach. It can be anything that community actually does. And it's drawing people out of isolation into a community aspect and a belonging. And I think that's probably one of the strongest tools that we actually have in the toolbox on the preventative scale, is to make people feel that they actually belong. And they have an ownership with what's here. And I think that's really important to us.
How do you think we start by doing that?
Wow, $64 question, that one. Community is really important, and it really is important in a sense of just ownership. the governor just recently has had a women's group where she's actually brought a whole group of women together from the community, from the Muslim community, and they have gardening and they grow vegetables. Now, it's not about the gardening or the vegetables, it's about bringing people together. And that is just so important across the board. And often as a Western society and Western community, we've lost our neighbourhoods a fair bit. We've become more diverse and dynamic and mobile, and we've actually lost that ownership of the street as such. And I think we can bring that back a little bit. And there's some simple things. It's not, as I say, it's not rocket science most of the time. It just is about engagement.
Yeah, a sense of belonging.
A sense of belonging, absolutely, yeah.
Do you think terrorism has changed at all within the last 10 to 20 years?
Going back over the journey, terrorism often used to be about an event or an issue, and I'm thinking of hijacked aeroplanes in the 70s, the Arab-Israeli issues. There was a lot of demands as to we want to see something happen. We want those people freed from jail, we want things along that line. So they were often quite single issue. This is an ideologue. It's a view that is a hate view, and it's about thuggery and death rather than trying to achieve a better or greater good. And that seems to be the drive of terrorism now. But the ideologue of this violent religion, and Islam's not a violent religion, but some of the perpetrators of it like to try to pretend and view it that way. It's very, very different. It's about changing people's mind, not resolving a situation. So it's very different.
In what direction do you think terrorism will develop?
There's been a significant focus on ISIL and the Middle East. ISIL, to a large extent, is vanishing, if not vanished, as a geographic entity. The concept and construct of a caliphate, a whole range of Islamic law and doctrine hasn't gone away. We can see in the southern Philippines that there are issues there now. We have a range of potential return fighters coming to our shores through Indonesia and back to Australia. We don't know what those numbers actually are. Experience tells us when fighters come back from a combat zone of any sort, they may be peaceful for some time, but they eventually go back to extreme violence. So that's potentially where we're headed. As I mentioned earlier, Denmark has a really good process for returned fighters. They don't incarcerate them, they reintegrate them into community and put a lot of support around them. That appears to be working. So I think in some instances we perhaps need a little bit of a quantum shift in our thought processes on how to manage this, because it is an issue and it will continue to be. That's probably for Australia in particular, that's the next iteration, is people coming back.
Well, I'm glad to have you on the job. We're unfortunately running out of time and are going to have to go to a break, but thank you so much for coming on and sharing your opinions and experiences.
Thanks very much for your time.
Stick around after the break. We're sharing a few of our favourite travel stories that have been sent in by viewers.